Hello, and welcome to this NACOM virtual session. U.S. military and intelligence services have identified thousands of social media posts that attack the courts and the justice system, and that originated with fake accounts, many coordinated by foreign governments, all designed to undermine public faith in our justice system. With a growing number of Americans reporting that they get their news from social media, it's time to get prepared for when the internet trolls land at your court's virtual front doors. That's why we call today's session Fighting Fake News, Preparing Your Court to Counter the Oncoming Slaught of Disinformation. My name is Jesse Rutledge. I'm a Vice President for External Affairs at the National Center for State Courts. And today I'll be doing part of the presentation. I'm also joined by my friend and colleague, Suzanne Spalding, who is the Senior Advisor for Homeland Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We're very sorry that we weren't able to join with you at the NACOM conference this summer in New Orleans, but we're glad that you decided to join us this afternoon. And as we go through the presentation, even though this is pre-recorded, we'll be monitoring the chat feature on the NACOM virtual page, which is located halfway down the page on the right-hand side. With that introduction, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Suzanne to begin.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you for your partnership, you and Mary McQueen and the National Center for State Courts, as we have worked over the last months to try to raise awareness about the nature of this risk, of this threat. You guys have been terrific partners, and thank you to the National Association of Court Management for giving us this opportunity to be here and talk with all of you about this important subject. Like Jesse, I wish we were all together in New Orleans and could get to know each other over a Sazerac, but there you have it. I'm glad that we at least have this opportunity to come to you virtually. And my discussion with you today, beyond the ballot, how the Kremlin works to undermine the U.S. justice system, is going to be illustrative of a broader set of issues that you will face. Next slide. So I want to start with some key points. This briefing is going to focus on Russian information operations that have targeted our U.S. justice system, and specifically targeting public faith and confidence in the independence and impartiality of our court system and our justice system. And I will share with you the evidence of these information operations and specific examples as we go along. But I think it's really important to explain at the outset that while Russia is the nation state that is most vigorously involved in trying to undermine our democracy and public faith in democratic institutions, that other countries are also engaged in influence operations and information operations, and even countries like China are beginning to understand why it might be in their interest to undermine confidence in our justice system and its independence, for example. And so while we have focused on Russia as the most aggressive actor, other countries are taking a page from the Kremlin's playbook, and we need to be aware of that. And of course, what you'll be more familiar with is the domestic voices that are out there undermining public faith and confidence in our justice system generally, and perhaps in your courts and your judges specifically. And what Russia will do, and this is the second key point, is to pick up on those weaknesses and vulnerabilities of our own making. So we will talk with you about the narratives that we're seeing in Russian information operations, but they will sound very familiar to you. Russia didn't make these up. The Kremlin, if the Kremlin went away tomorrow, these narratives would still be out there in our domestic discourse. The difference between what the Kremlin is doing in these information operations and domestic voices that are judicial reform advocates or who are seeking justice to make our justice system better is that their goal is to improve our institutions. The advocates' goal is to improve our institutions and to make our country stronger. That is not Putin's goal. And that is the key difference. Next slide. So I came to this issue having served as the Undersecretary at the Department of Homeland Security, responsible for cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection. And of course, election infrastructure is part of that critical infrastructure. And so in 2016, I spent a lot of time working with my colleagues in the department and with my colleagues throughout the federal government, and of course, state and local officials, trying to secure our elections in 2016. Here's what we saw in terms of malign foreign influence operations. We saw clearly the propaganda efforts that we've become much more aware of since the election, much of that on social media. We saw the hack and leak of emails, which was also clearly part of those information operations. But we also saw what looked like traditional cyber activity hacking into voter registration databases and attempting to do so all across the country. And what we realized at DHS when we began to see this cyber activity attacking voter registration databases, initially we thought maybe they were after the personally identifiable information, the personal information that was in these databases. But we pretty quickly realized that that information was not all that sensitive. Much of it is available publicly. And it didn't take us long to realize that what they were really probably trying to do was to further the goal of their information operations by undermining the credibility of our election itself. Imagine if you could get in and change those databases, either by deleting a lot of names, changing the spelling, changing addresses. You could cause a great deal of disruption on election day as people showed up to vote and found their names, for example, were no longer on the polling lists. And it was our assessment that that traditional cyber activity was actually part of and designed to enable information operations just as much as the hacking of the emails that were then released. So that's a really important point. We're going to focus today on traditional propaganda and particularly the use of social media, although we'll also talk about the other outlets. But it's important to understand that traditional cyber activities can be part of information operations. Next slide, please. We're used to thinking about reputational damage as being a collateral impact of a cyber attack, right, or a cyber hack. But what we're saying is that it may be that your reputation is really the objective of malicious cyber activity that you may see. And if you think about the concerns that we have with respect to malicious cyber activity, the consequences we worry about, it's consequences that have to do with losing confidentiality of information, losing access to information, right? Think of ransomware and even DDoS attacks. And then loss of trust in the integrity of the information that you may be holding. So that information can be changed or corrupted. And if you think about those three and you apply them to the courts, you can pretty quickly see how malicious cyber activity could be used to damage the reputation of a court, of the justice system, of judges. Hack and leak of sensitive court documents, altering data, for example, court orders, who should be released, who shouldn't, even altering draft opinions, for example, preventing access to information. And we've certainly seen that in some of the ransomware attacks that have affected municipalities. Next slide, please. But as I said, we're going to focus primarily on kind of classic information operation techniques. And when I got out of DHS, having focused on the election infrastructure, I understood that Putin's goal was much broader than just elections. The intelligence community's assessment is that the activity we saw in 2016 was just one part of an ongoing, much longer term and much broader effort to undermine our democracy. and our institutions. And I thought to myself, I did what we call in the intelligence community, where I spent a number of years, we called it red teaming. I tried to put myself in Putin's head. If I were Putin and I wanted to undermine democracy and its institutions, where would I go next, having mucked around in elections? And I thought, what other institution is as dependent as elections are on public faith and confidence in the integrity of the process to respect the legitimacy of the outcome? And I immediately, having been trained as a lawyer and practiced law for a number of years, I immediately thought of the justice system. And I know all of you can imagine that. And so I hadn't heard anything about it, and I thought maybe we were getting out ahead of something. But as we began to look, we realized that no, this had been going on for quite some time. The first thing we came across is the Lisa case. This is actually in Germany, in Berlin. A young girl of Russian origin named Lisa claimed that she had been kidnapped and raped by refugees, by immigrants. The police took her and got her story, but she very quickly broke down and admitted that she'd made the whole thing up. She'd spent the night with a friend and was afraid to tell her parents. There was no abduction, there was no rape by immigrants or anyone else. And the authorities put that word out fairly quickly. But already Russian media had picked up on the original allegations, and on its traditional propaganda outlets began to run this story of this young girl of Russian heritage who had been abducted and raped. And the story was that they told was that the prosecutor and the justice system was covering up this horrible crime in order to protect the politicians in Germany who were soft on immigration and soft on admitting refugees, and that they were putting these refugees ahead of their own people. And that story took hold on social media, and in fact, they were able to turn out protests in the streets all across Germany against the justice system for failing to prosecute this crime that was never committed. So that's January of 2016. Next slide. Fast forward 6 months to July of 2016, and now we're in Twin Falls, Idaho, where a story is running rampant on social media that 2 young Syrian refugees raped a young girl at knife point and were later seen high-fiving their dads. What in fact happened was that authorities came upon 2 young boys and a young girl in the basement of an apartment building. Something untoward happened and they took the boys into custody, or it appeared that something untoward had happened, but they very quickly determined there was no rape, there was no knife, there was no high-fiving of the dads, and there were no Syrian refugees involved. In fact, at the time, there were no Syrian refugees in Twin Falls, Idaho. But by then, social media had hold of these original allegations and would not let them go, and accused the authorities, once again, the justice system, of covering up this horrific crime to protect the politicians who were soft on immigration. Next slide. These are a couple of the tweets that were running around on social media. These are both tweets by Russian trolls. These accounts have been attributed to the Internet Research Agency, the organization in St. Petersburg, Russia, that has been identified as turning out all of these fake accounts pretending to be Americans, designed to pour gasoline on the flames of division and distrust that already engulf our online discourse. And these are just a couple of the tweets around what was happening in Twin Falls, Idaho, that were posted by Russians sitting in this building in St. Petersburg, Russia, railing against the justice system as, again, being soft on immigrants and on refugees. Next slide, please. Secured Borders was a group that tried to organize a rally just as they had successfully done all across Germany, the protests in the streets. Secured Borders is not a group of concerned Twin Falls, citizens of Twin Falls, Idaho, but a fake affinity group, again made up by the Kremlin, by the Internet Research Agency, by those Russian trolls. You can read about Secured Borders in the criminal indictment that the Department of Justice handed down in October of 2018. They were involved in a number of activities across the country, but here they are in Twin Falls, Idaho, trying to get people out into the streets. The notice that went out for this rally talked about the need to fire all of the politicians and the members of the justice system who are covering up this horrific crime and putting refugees ahead of citizens. And you can see the emotional appeal in the imagery. Next slide, please. Again, even though the authorities came out with the facts, and Wendy Olson, who was the local federal prosecutor, tried to talk about this and ask people not to spread the false information, it really was, it took hold and went rampant. And this is a screenshot from a website called Barenaked Islam. This is the judge in this case in Twin Falls, Idaho, and you can see the red arrow, corrupt judge. His home address and phone number were posted, and he was harassed very significantly. Next slide. So looking more broadly at how Russia is doing this, we see three propaganda channels that they are using. They're clearly using social media. You see the tweet down in the corner there. They have their Russian-sponsored and paid for programming. This is RT, this is RT outlet, which is both on cable television and on YouTube. RT, of course, stands for Russia Today. And then there are official statements from Russian officials. This is Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, who, again, in the Lisa case, for example, himself made public statements about how the German officials were sweeping this horrific crime under the rug, a crime that never happened. Next slide. So as we pored over the 11 million tweets and many, many Facebook posts that were released in 2017 and 2018 that had been traced to Russia, to the Kremlin, to the Internet Research Agency, we looked closely at the content. And these are the narrative frames that we saw coming up over and over again in the propaganda that was targeting the justice system. And they all go to undermining the public's faith in the independence and impartiality of that justice system. So the narratives that we saw jump out, again, these are picking up on pre-existing narratives within this country that continue to be pushed by domestic voices as well, but that are really being promoted by the Kremlin to convey a sense of an irrevocably broken justice system, not one that is susceptible to change and needs to be reformed, but one that is irrevocably broken. The first is that the justice system tolerates, protects, and covers up crimes committed by immigrants. We've talked about that. That the justice system operationalizes the institutionally racist and corrupt police state, hitting at themes of racial injustice. That the justice system directly supports and enables corrupt corporations, and that the justice system is a tool of the political elite, and that judges are just politicians who wear robes. Next slide, please. So here's an example again of attacks on a Ninth Circuit District Judge, Judge James Robart, who handed down one of the very first rulings on the president's travel ban early on. And again, these are Russian trolls posing as Americans. Tennessee GOP was a particularly active troll account, and Texas Lone Star another one. And again, you can see this narrative that the justice system is irrevocably broken. Next slide. Here's a case you may remember. This was Kate Steinle, was the young woman who was tragically shot on the pier in Santa Monica near Embarcadero. And the jury ultimately acquitted the undocumented immigrant who had been charged with her shooting, finding that it was an accidental shooting. And as we looked at with our colleagues across the civil society at accounts that were affiliated with Russia, we saw the trending topics. Kate Steinle shot to #1 and was really off the charts in the level of activity because the Russians saw an opportunity again to push this narrative of an irrevocably broken justice system that fails to protect citizens against illegal immigrants. And so again, these are tweets from Russian trolls pretending to be Americans, talking about how irrevocably broken our justice system is. Next slide. And they are really perfectly happy to play on both sides of any issue. We are familiar with the understanding now that Russia aims to promote division in our society, and they will use division around our justice system to accomplish that, and at the same time use that division to undermine trust in our justice system. So here we see on one side another fake affinity group called Black Matters US, which is trying to pick up on Black Lives Matter, but it's a fake affinity group. And here they are talking about the justice system and racial injustice and how it is again enabling the racist police state. This was in the wake of the shooting of a young Black man, Alton Sterling. But a few days later, when Mika Johnson in Texas shot police officers during some protests, the Russians jumped in to try to organize people around Blue Lives Matter. And we see this time and time again, particularly around racial issues, where they are willing to jump in on either side. And we'll see this again when we look at the Russian-sponsored propaganda outlets. But just an indication, these again are both Russian tweets on both sides of the issue. Next slide. And these are some more examples of what we see out there on the propaganda outlets. So more from Black Matters and issues around racial justice. RT picks up on this issue a good bit. Sputnik is the other outlet that is, they have a regular program called Criminal Injustice, and every episode is about how irrevocably broken our justice system is. Next slide. So this is my favorite, America's Lawyer. America's Lawyer is a program weekly on Russia Today on RT. It's hosted by a U.S. trial attorney in Pensacola, Florida. And its theme every single week is how irrevocably broken our justice system is. And this is a typical opening. This is from one of the weekly shows. To say that the justice system in the United States is broken would be a gross understatement. Corporations and corrupt politicians have taken control, turning the once impartial judiciary into a tool for the elite to use for their own gain. That is the theme that runs through every week. And this program appears again on cable news and cable TV all across the country and on YouTube. And while it does not have a huge following, it has a significant following. And their hope, of course, is to introduce these ideas and these narratives, or to amplify these ideas and these narratives through then traditional social media and through domestic voices. Next slide. So this is one of their programs in which they went after state courts. You can see the title headline, if you will, is "To Whom Are State Courts Loyal?" And again, the America's Lawyers theme is largely populist. They actually don't mention Trump a lot. They do mention Biden and Pelosi and Obama and attack them on a fairly regular basis. But they are perfectly happy to go really after Republicans or Democrats. And in this case, they are talking about how all of our state courts and our state judges, particularly those who run for election, are bought by corrupt corporations. Next slide. I've been talking about America's Lawyer and RT now for about almost 3 years, 2.5 years. And I could tell that I was hitting a nerve when they finally decided to come after me. And these are just a couple screenshots from the programs in which they attacked me. And you see America's Lawyer there with my picture in the middle. And I will say I had been giving America's Lawyer the benefit of the doubt, not having been able to delve into every one of their episodes to fact check them, but understanding that even if you portray facts accurately, you can present them in such a one-sided way as to create a totally misleading picture. For example, that our courts are completely owned by corrupt corporations. You can take some corporate cases and have people extrapolate out to the entire system. But it really wasn't until they took on a subject that I know something about, which is me, that I realized how fast and loose they really are with the facts. In this episode, and they actually took me on in a couple of different episodes. In this one, they talked about how I was being paid millions of dollars by defense industry and beating the drums of war against Russia. And I will say that when my husband saw this, he was thought I was holding out on him. I'm not, sad to say, not paid millions of dollars, and we are funded by foundations, not by corporations. But this is typical of what RT does. Next slide. And if you think maybe it's just collateral damage and maybe it's not really focused on the justice system, for me, I keep coming back to this quote. This is Putin. This is in the fall of 2017, after we had seized some additional diplomatic facilities. And Putin had a press conference in which he said that he'd asked his envoy in the United States to sue in US courts for this violation of their property rights. And then he said, "We will see how effectively the much lauded American judicial system works." Putin knows that our justice system has been held up as an example all over the world as an independent and impartial system. He knows that our democracy has been held up around the world. And Putin, I believe, has 3 key goals. His first and foremost, actually, is his own population. He wants them to believe that our system is as corrupt and broken as his system is, so that they won't long for liberal democracy. He watched the color revolutions, and he doesn't want that happening in his country. So he wants to portray our system as irrevocably broken. His second audience is the American public, because he understands that if the American public loses faith in democracy and its institutions, they will disengage. And if we lose any hope of discerning fact from fiction, if we do not believe that our institutions can be reformed, can change, can be held to a higher standard to live up to our aspirations, then we will disengage. And we lose the informed and engaged citizenry upon which a democracy really depends. And his third audience is countries around the world where we compete for influence. Again, he's not trying to hold up the Russian system. He's trying to pull our system down to their level. Next slide. So this is the FBI director, Christopher Wray, who has, the FBI and our intelligence professionals understand that this is the broader goals that Putin seeks. And he's talking about how this is not just about elections, but this is about an effort, yes, to sow divisiveness and discord, but to undermine America's faith in democracy, and that it is a 365-day-a-year threat. Next slide, please. So these are two reports that we've done at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. If you want to read more about this, the Beyond the Ballot is a more detailed description of the efforts specifically targeting the justice system. The Countering Adversary Threats to Democratic Institutions is a broader look based on a couple of roundtables with a bipartisan group of national security experts to talk about adversary actions generally trying to undermine public faith in our democracy and democratic institutions. Both can be found at csis.org. Next slide. So based on the recommendations in both of those reports, we have been not just studying this problem, but trying to counter it. And this is where the National Center for State Courts has been such a wonderful partner, as has the Administrative Office of the Courts and the Federal Judicial Center at the federal level. We have continued to research and raise awareness. We are providing training around disinformation and the ways it can be enabled through cybersecurity for judges and the courts. And many of you may have participated in some of our workshops or perhaps heard me speak in Newport 2 Augusts ago when Mary McQueen invited me to come and speak. And so thank you for that. But we are providing regular training for state courts and their state judges and justices and their staffs. We are looking at rapid response capabilities and an educational network of potentially retired judges, lawyers, law students, law professors, all across the country who could help put down disinformation, help validate correct information, help the public understand how our court systems work. And as part of that, an important lesson that we've learned as we've looked at these information operations is the importance of building societal resilience against this pernicious messaging. So there's a lot of work being done on the platforms to try to shut these inauthentic accounts down, to try to identify disinformation and either reduce it so that it doesn't appear at the top of your searches, or when appropriate to remove it, to label it. But I think ultimately the best defense against this kind of information operation is to build up our public resilience. And we think the best way to do that is to reinvigorate civic education all across this country. Putin's goal is to divide us, to get us to give up on democracy. And it's our belief that that makes civic education a national security imperative. We need to remind Americans about their shared beliefs and their shared values, what democracy is all about, why it is important, and that it is under attack. And it is not just enough to understand that there are 3 branches of government, or even exactly how the courts work, though both of those are important. But it's also important to equip Americans to understand how they can be more effective agents of change. Next slide. So in our training, we're working with courts on development of playbooks, the steps that should be taken before an event, making sure that you've identified all the people that need to be part of that response team if you become aware of disinformation that is undermining public confidence in your court, and understanding what your response options are and what kind of messaging you should have in place and kind of some templates prepared to go when this happens, because speed can be very important. We all know the adage about how fast, how lies can make its way halfway around the world before truth can get their shoes on. And so these are the elements of our playbook. Next slide. Some of the key takeaways that we've developed in the course of conversations with courts through these workshops are the importance of testing, of exercising these plans. Again, the importance of civic education and the role that judges can and should play in educating their communities ahead of time. That in responding, you always want to lead with the facts and you want to avoid repeating the disinformation when you put out your statement. That ahead of time, you want to establish relationships with key stakeholders, both those who are skeptical and are likely to believe disinformation, but also those who can validate, who can help the public understand what the true facts are as appropriate. And of course, always, as all of you know, the importance of speaking plainly to the public in ways that they can understand. And increasingly, it's important to think about whether you've got a case that may be controversial, for example, that may fit one of those four narratives we talked about at the outset, and considering in those situations being even more fulsome in the written decisions of the court, even in with respect to decisions that would normally not warrant, for example, a written opinion. And I'm thinking now particularly of the election cases that are already in many of your courts and will likely be in nearly all of them in the run up to and the immediately after the election, particularly around decisions being made with respect to COVID. Those cases are going to be controversial because the political stakes are so high, and they will be very tempting targets for malicious actors, including Russia. And so it's really important to be thinking now about what you can put out in advance of those cases, about the processes that will be used, for example, for making those decisions, perhaps even about the standards that might be applied, and certainly to make sure that there are clearly written decisions. Next slide. This was the Chief Justice's year-end report. We have had a great partnership with the Judicial Conference that he leads in trying to educate our justice system, our judges all across the country. We were pleased to see that in his year-end report, he highlighted the dangers of disinformation and the role of judges. He said, "We've come to take democracy for granted, and civic education has fallen by the wayside. In our age, when social media can instantly spread rumor and false information on a grand scale, the public's need to understand our government and the protections it provides is ever more vital. The judiciary has an important role to play in civic education." Next slide. So when I present this to judges, I emphasize the role that they play on the front lines of defending democracy. All of you do as well. The work that you do day in and day out is what makes public faith and confidence in our justice system possible. And so I say, this is my bumper sticker: defend democracy, change your password. Thank you very much. Jesse, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was a great presentation. I've seen you give it several times, and every time I watch it, I come back with new takeaways, because you do such a good job of unpacking something that is extremely complex into terms that are very easy for everybody to understand. So thank you. And on behalf of the National Center for State Courts, I want to reiterate how much we appreciate the partnership with you and your colleagues. With the amount of time that we have left today, I'm going to use the balance of it to talk about similar information, but in a slightly different way. I'm going to spend some time reviewing the survey research that the National Center has conducted over the last couple of years in order for us to understand where the average American is on this issue, how they react to it, and what sort of messages might be effective in countering disinformation. So you're going to see a fair amount of data that we've pulled from our survey results and some information that we gathered in conducting some focus groups at the end of 2019. So before we get to the detail around disinformation, let me start with some big picture questions here. We have been conducting annual public opinion surveys for about the last 7 years in our State of the State Courts series. And in our 2019 survey, we did ask some questions specifically about attitudes towards disinformation. We wanted to begin by understanding whether people were aware of this issue and whether or not they think it's a serious concern. And in this slide, you can see the reaction that we got from our survey. You can see that it's somewhat split, that not one of these particular responses captures a majority of respondents. So the good news for those of us concerned about this issue is that a plurality, 42% of our respondents, do see Russian interference and disinformation as a major threat to all of the country's institutions. A smaller percentage, only 16%, believe it's a major issue, but believe that issue is confined only to elections, presumably because that's what they've heard the most about. We have about 27% who don't believe that Russian meddling, foreign interference is a major threat, that really it's just media hype. And then 15%, which is about 1 out of every 7 people who just don't know. They don't have enough information to form an opinion. So we begin from a perspective where Americans are sort of all over the map on this issue, which does present some challenges for communications. Now, let me step back just for a moment and talk a bit about why we think the disinformation campaigns on social media are so critical for state courts to address. We, in our last survey, wanted to get a better sense of where people say that they're getting their information about the state courts. And you can see from this slide up right here that the overall sample of our survey by about 2 out of 3 individuals tell us that a state court website is the place that they would go if they were looking for information. You can see that there are a variety of other options that we gave them, and you can see that many of them are quite popular. Newspapers, including newspaper websites, talking with family or friends, information from their local elected officials, from their churches, their community groups. Now, down towards the bottom, you can see that the court's social media feed and one's own social media feed rank down there, but with about 1 out of 3 of our overall sample saying they would consult either of those sources. However, the column on the right tells a somewhat different story. These are the people who are under the age of 40, and you can see the numbers are a little bit different. And what I want to draw your attention to is the number of individuals who are under 40 who tell us that they are more likely to be looking at social media. You can see there's a big jumps between 38% and 56% and 34% and 58%. They, of course, are looking at lots of other things right now. But my point here is that as you see time elapse and as you see more people become comfortable with social media, as this new generation takes hold, you're going to see much more what I'll call dependence on social media, or at least social media as a primary source of information. This is important for the courts. because we historically have not done a great job of communicating via social media, and we really need to start doing that, particularly if we want to be effective in being resilient and being able to counter potential disinformation campaigns. So as I've said, there's a little bit of a variety in how social media is used by Americans, and I want to spend a moment and look at this in a little more detail. So this slide demonstrates answers to the question, how often do you use each of the following social media platforms? And in case you're not familiar with these platforms, the orange-red icon on the bottom left stands for YouTube. You probably recognize Facebook in the middle. And on the right, that icon represents Instagram, one of the newer and growing in popularity social media channels. So these are somewhat startling numbers for many of us, perhaps, in that we have 50% of all Americans, 1 out of every 2 people, telling us that they use YouTube at least once a week, if not more often, 50%. If you look at Facebook, the usage is higher, and it's particularly even higher for people who say they're under 50, where it jumps from 60% to 69%. And then on the right, with Instagram, you can see a really sharp contrast between 30% overall who say they use it, and then a big demographic difference with people under 50 reporting 51% saying that they use it regularly. People over 50 say they almost never use it, only 11%. Now, again, I'd ask you to think about not just this moment in time, but how time will change and how social media consumption patterns will change. And we're going to see many more people dependent on social media for their information, making it all the more important. So with that information presented as an overview, let's talk a little more about some of the themes around disinformation that Suzanne mentioned in her presentation. We begin from the perspective that we know that there's a fair amount of skepticism about the justice system already. We conduct some focus groups in suburban Chicago, and this was at the end of October 2019, so fairly recently. And before we even started talking to people about disinformation and foreign influence, we asked them just to tell us what they thought about the courts and the justice system generally. And these are the kinds of quotations that we got back from actual Americans sitting in a room talking about the court system. And you can see that they're fairly skeptical, including one male African-American participant said, "As I said before, they stopped me for no reason. I wasn't even doing anything. You don't have to be a criminal to be treated like one." It's those kinds of attitudes that that the Russians have picked up on and are tapping into with their disinformation campaigns. In other words, they're going to where people already are and trying to exacerbate those feelings. One of the things that we found really interesting in this work is that the disinformation that has been presented through these social media channels is quite different from what I'll call a sort of old-fashioned propaganda. This disinformation looks very credible and very legitimate. So let me give you an example here. On the right-hand side is one of the tweets that Suzanne's group got from Twitter as an example of something that was generated out of Russia, out of St. Petersburg. But you can see that on that tweet, which allegedly comes from somebody named Robert R., who says, "Law and disorder, judge accused of sneaking an illegal immigrant out of a courtroom to help him avoid ICE agents, immigration agents." Now, what you probably can't see is in the top right-hand corner in Robert R.'s picture, he has a thin blue line flag. And so when we presented this to our focus group participants and told them that this was fake, that it had been generated out of Russia, one of the reactions we got is from this gentleman who said, I mean, the guy had a blue line flag. How could he be bad, right? Yeah, so I'm shocked. I shouldn't be, but I am. In other words, these tweets, this kind of content can be very hard to discern truth from fiction, domestic from international, because they do such a good job of appearing to be legitimate. Another participant, referring to some of the famous Nigerian prince emails, said, I never would have expected to see something like this. I'm used to seeing, like, the Nigerian princes where everything is misspelled or it's just words where they're a little off. These are really well put together. So that is a bit of a challenge for all of us in trying to detect what is true from what is disinformation. As I've said, a lot of these posts are already attempting to not drive new wedges, but to further the wedges that already exist and inflame controversial societal issues. Again, going back to the idea that many people don't see these sorts of communications or tweets as being unusual or something that might raise their eyebrow. For them, as one person put it, if you live here, you know it's true. This is stuff we see on a daily basis. So there's nothing that really stands out. This was after we presented a series of tweets that were very critical of the US justice and court system. So how do we go about trying to inform people, enlighten people, and what sort of steps might we be able to take to limit the spread of disinformation? Well, for a lot of people, the answer is simple. If it's fake, just take it down. But for a greater number of people, that's a bit of a problematic answer because a lot of the proposed policy solutions do run head on into free speech principles. And Americans care very, very deeply about the First Amendment and their free speech rights. And when you start talking to them about, well, maybe we should just delete this or get rid of it, they are a little skeptical and they generally don't like that idea. They start asking, well, who's going to do that? Is the government going to be picking and choosing what stays up and what comes down? Are we leaving this to the social media corporations? They are skeptical that will be effective. We did find in our research that the support for regulation is a little bit stronger with those who tell us that they have higher levels of education, and that's encouraging. But on the other hand, it's important to keep in mind that only 1 out of 3 Americans has a college degree. That's a very limited number of people. If you're trying to build a communications campaign, you can't speak just to 1/3 of the population. One person in the focus groups told us the clearly fake accounts, that shouldn't even be a question, that should automatically be done. And that is something I agree that Facebook should be doing. Again, we're talking about somebody who has brought their education to the table here and is willing to accept that as an outcome if these tweets or Facebook posts can be clearly identified as inauthentic, which, as we've said before, is by itself a bit of a challenge. So we did find that there is one fairly compelling argument that we should be using when it comes to looking at what's being posted and whether things should be deleted or not. And that's the idea that while free speech is important, foreign governments and internet trolls don't have the same free speech rights as US citizens. This is an important point to communicate. Yes, free speech is important. Yes, we want to protect it. On the other hand, free speech isn't accorded to these other entities. Foreign governments and internet trolls do not have the same rights that the rest of us have. So as we communicate about that, one challenge that we have found is that there is a bit of a difference between people who tell us that they are heavy social media users and people who are light social media users. And the irony here is that the people who tell us they use social media more frequently, more often, on more channels, are not as likely to find this argument as persuasive, which could be a problem in the long run, because as more of the country adopts social media use as a norm, apparently they also bring with them a belief that those platforms should be fairly open. So what do we say and what do we do about this? Our research indicates that our communications and messaging should focus on the concept of shared values, values-based messaging. And let me tell you a bit about what that actually means. We tested a series of different statements, and keep in mind that each respondent saw more than the words that you're seeing on the screen here. Each respondent heard about a paragraph of an argument, and these are just the summaries of those arguments. You can see from looking at the bottom, from the bottom up, that the strongest argument in terms of how compelling people found these takes was that we have more as Americans that unites us than we have that divides us, and we should be focusing on what it is that we have as a country that pulls us together, and we should reject these efforts from the outside to divide us. So again, very values-based messaging. You can see that the next most persuasive argument, very close, civics education should be used to remind us of our shared values. And Suzanne talked a bit about that at the conclusion of her remarks about the importance of re-engaging the citizenry in civics education, and particularly focusing on this concept of values that courts as institutions uphold, that they protect our rights, that they uphold the Constitution, that they uphold the rule of law. These kinds of uniquely American values need to be something that we remind everybody about, that these institutions perform these functions, and let's use civics education to remind them of those facts. Not as compelling an argument is the argument that the US justice system is the envy of the world. And that's also, again, a very traditional argument that our system is the best, and that we should be making sure that it remains the best so that the rest of the world sees us as that city on the hill. And while it's got a decent amount of support, you can see that it lags behind the other two of these arguments that are more values-based than talking about just institutions purely. That brings me to the end of my slides and the end of our presentation. And as I indicated at the outset, Suzanne and I will be available and have been available answering your questions in the chat box. And if you'd like more information about the work that either the National Center for State Courts is doing on this issue or the Center for Strategic and International Studies, I hope that you will contact us directly. With that, I will again thank Suzanne for joining me in this presentation, and we wish all of you a very good day.